back.
Thousands upon thousands of corpses, with clouds of flies hovering over them, the nauseating smell of rotting bodies, survivors who looked like living skeletons. These were just some of the brutal images seen by Allied soldiers as they began liberating the concentration camps set up across Germany. The months or even years of cruelty they inflicted on their prisoners left marks they could never erase.
Люди, поможіть! Молим вас, поможете! Još je živ! Još ga možete spasiti!
It is not surprising that some of the Allied soldiers could not contain their emotions when witnessing such cruelty. The camps of captivity were bathed in the blood of their prisoners. But when the war ended, it was the guards who suffered the consequences of their actions. Sometimes, it was the prisoners who took revenge, and sometimes it was the American or British troops themselves. For them, it was the least they deserved for the terrible atrocities committed. That is why today, in this new military history video, we will tell you all about the brutal scenes witnessed by the Allies in the concentration camps and their visceral reactions to them. By mid-1944, it was clear that Germany was on the ropes. The Soviet Union's Red Army, after great and bloody victories on its own territory, was rapidly heading towards Berlin, killing every Nazi who crossed its path. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies had succeeded in carrying out the brutal landing in Normandy and were also advancing at a good pace towards the heart of the Reich. Fearing what might happen after the end of the conflict, Heinrich Himmler, in charge of the organization of the concentration camps, ordered his men to eliminate all traces of the final solution, the systematic plan to exterminate approximately 6 million Jews.
La progresión de los ejércitos aliados por el oeste y de los soviéticos por el este propició que Himmler cerrase los campos, enviando a los deportados a horribles marchas de la muerte. Los presos estaban en la carretera, pero no tenían rumbo. Los nazis no tenían tiempo de gasear a la gente, así que los mataron de frío y hambre. Los que no podían seguir el ritmo de la marcha recibían un disparo en la cabeza.
Adolf Hitler's enemies knew how sadistic and gruesome his men were. They had already found evidence of the Germans' massacres of civilians. But when they began to liberate territory previously occupied by the Germans, they witnessed their darkest crimes firsthand. The first concentration camp to be liberated was Majdanek, located in Poland, on July 22, 1944 by Soviet soldiers. It was established near the Lublin ghetto, where much of the area's Jewish population had been forced to live. When the Nazis needed labor for forced labor, they began bringing these people to the detention center, but the place was quickly turned into an extermination camp. Using 7 gas chambers, the Germans killed approximately 80,000 men, women, and children there. Due to the rapid advance of the Soviets, the Germans were unable to destroy the evidence of their crimes before fleeing, so Majdanek was captured almost intact. This was the first time the Allies were confronted with the full extent of Nazi cruelty.
They encountered piles of corpses and thousands of skeletal prisoners on the verge of death from malnutrition and disease. This was their first encounter with the horror of what would come to be known as the Holocaust. They began to understand that the Nazis had committed atrocities against civilians, the vast majority of them Jews, on an unimaginable scale.
Majdanek was only the first of hundreds of liberated concentration camps. In all of them, the evidence of the brutality to which the prisoners were subjected was overwhelming. Auschwitz, perhaps the most notorious of these terrible places, began to be evacuated by the Nazis on January 17, 1945. With them, Tens of thousands of Jews and other prisoners were forced into the Reich to continue their captivity. Thousands more, too weak to march, remained until Soviet soldiers began to arrive on January 27th. The Germans found it impossible to erase the evidence of what they had done there. In some sheds, there were hundreds of thousands of suits and dresses, all belonging to murdered people. In addition, more than 7,000 kilos of human hair were found, due to the custom of shaving the heads of captives as soon as they arrived.
Der hat dort gestanden, alle mit Uniformen, nur Augen, ganz schmale. Das war sehr, sehr schrecklich. Ja, sehr schrecklich.
Many Soviet soldiers, veterans of a terrible war and witnesses of all kinds of cruelty, broke down in tears when they saw the evidence of Nazi crimes. Some seemed to feel ashamed or even guilty that human brutality could reach such extremes. Only a few prisoners celebrated their release. The vast majority were so weak that they were unable to move or even understand what was happening. Many believed it was a cruel trick by their captors to make them think their captivity was over. It was only when they were taken to hospitals and offered nutritious food for the first time in months or years that they understood they had regained their freedom. Of the 1.3 million people who arrived at Auschwitz, only 7,000 remained in the camp when the Soviets arrived. Although the Red Army soldiers shared their findings with the Western Allies, the latter would soon experience them for themselves. By April 1945, American and British fighters were deep inside German territory. The Nazis were constantly being forced back further and further towards Berlin. But as they moved towards their capital, they were also forced to abandon the concentration camps on German soil. On April 11th, American soldiers liberated Buchenwald. A resistance organization had taken control of the detention center earlier that day to prevent the last Nazi guards from committing atrocities against their prisoners before fleeing. However, for many it was already too late. By the time the Allies arrived, most of the captives could barely stand.
En abril de 1945 los estadounidenses entraron en el campo de concentración de Ortrud, una ramificación de Buchenwald. Eisenhower estaba sobrecogido. Nunca he estado tan conmocionado en toda mi vida, confesó. Patton se puso enfermo junto a un cobertizo.
The Allied generals had read the Soviet reports, but most of the lower-ranking soldiers had not expected the brutal images found in the camps. The Americans and British, many of them under the age of 20, could barely comprehend what they were seeing. The rumors they might have heard were nothing compared to what they were now witnessing. By the end of the war, there were so many corpses in these places that the guards had not even attempted to dispose of them, so they were left completely out in the open. These thousands of bodies bore the marks of the torture and hardship they were subjected to throughout their captivity. According to the testimonies of the liberators, the smell was the first thing perceived, even before seeing the prisoners. The years of overcrowding with almost no hygiene produced a stench that made many of the soldiers vomit upon entering the camps. The few survivors looked like skeletons due to lack of food, and thousands died after being released from the diseases they had contracted there. Typhus was one of the most common, which caused rashes all over the body, high fevers, and even delirium. Many of the infected, having such low defenses due to the inhumane conditions to which they were subjected, were never able to recover. Several of the camps had to be completely incinerated to prevent the spread of this and other diseases.
Our medical battalions worked 2 days and nights binding wounds and giving medications. But for advanced cases of starvation and tuberculosis, there were often no cures. The survivors are shown being evacuated for treatment in Allied hospitals.
In some cases, Allied soldiers could not contain their emotions provoked by the macabre scenes they witnessed. On April 29th, American troops advanced on Dachau, another of the concentration camps on German territory. The SS men in charge of security at the camp, upon learning that their enemies were nearby, began to destroy evidence of their crimes, but they were not fast enough. When they surrendered, there were still many signs of their sadistic behavior. Upon entering, The Americans found 39 wagons full of naked corpses, so thin that the bones could be seen beneath the skin. There were about 2,000 bodies there, some of them with signs that they had been recently murdered. For a group of Allied soldiers, this was too much. They needed revenge. Even today, it is not known exactly what happened. According to some of the witnesses, 50 German SS men, after their surrender, were gathered in front of one of the walls of the camp. A squad of Americans, some of whom carried machine guns, were tasked with keeping a close watch on them. This is where accounts differ. Some sources stated that the prisoners tried to escape, so the soldiers opened fire. Dozens were killed almost instantly, while many others were seriously wounded. Following other accounts, however, we find a mass summary execution in retaliation for the atrocities committed at Dachau. Whatever the truth, between 35 and 50 Germans died after their surrender within the walls of the center of the camp. Many of those wounded by bullets never received medical attention and bled slowly to death in the snow.
Didn't really feel good about what happened there. But also, I have to admit, I felt there was a certain amount of revenge. And in a way, I felt that even though these may not have been the men who perpetrated this sort of thing, at least you were paid back a little bit for these people, what happened to them.
Dachau is perhaps the best-known case of a camp whose liberation turned bloody against its oppressors, but it was far from the only one. Mauthausen, in Austria, was one of the last detention centers to be reached by the Allies. It was between 3rd and 6th May, days after Adolf Hitler, seeing that the war was lost, decided to take his own life. This camp was one of the most brutal in all of Nazi Germany. The inhuman conditions to which its prisoners were subjected caused the death of more than 90,000 people, approximately half of those who set foot there. As in many other such prisons, the cause of the deaths were not only the German guards, but also the so-called capos. These were captives who collaborated with their captors in exchange for better living conditions, which meant supervising the rest of the prisoners and often also torturing them. Sometimes, they were even crueler than the Nazis.
אני בהתחלה שהגעתי, אז תכף שאלת את הכבוי מתי יש ביקור הורים, מתי אני יכולה לבקר, מתי אני יכולה לפגוש. אמרת במחנה כזה. 3 ימים, 4 ימים, 5 ימים. אנחנו ראינו מהמחנה שלנו, איפה שגרנו, ערובה ענקית שיוצא מזה לעבוד, לא עשן, לעבוד. אז היא אומרת לי, את רואה שם נשרפו כולם. שם נשרפה אמא שלנו והאחים שלנו.
By the time American soldiers arrived at Mauthausen, most of the guards had evacuated the camp, but dozens of them were still there. After the Allies disarmed these men, chaos broke out. The prisoners took the opportunity to take revenge on the people who had tormented them for years. Many were decapitated with their own knives, and in several cases, their heads were reportedly placed on stakes in a macabre display of rage. The capos were not spared from the wave of retribution. Those who had not fled were hunted down and killed with guns, or even beaten to death. In many cases, American soldiers, sickened by the brutal images they encountered each time they arrived at a camp, did not intervene to help the Nazis. To them, it was exactly what they deserved.
On the first night after the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp, all the prisoners who had collaborated with the administration, or the so-called capo, were also executed by the prisoners. They were strangled, torn apart, some had their heads crushed, and some were simply hanged. Altogether, about 300 prisoners became victims of the first night after the liberation.
On May 8, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. World War II in Europe came to an end. By then, only a few concentration camps remained to be liberated. In these, the guards peacefully laid down their weapons and let their prisoners go. But even though the days of captivity were over, the deaths continued to occur. The malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease to which these people were subjected for years was too much for many of them. Tens of thousands lost their lives months after the end of hostilities due to these factors. A large number of them decided to take their own lives, unable to comprehend the cruelty they had experienced. Even some Allied soldiers could not cope with what they saw in the camps and made the same tragic decision. The war continued to claim victims even after it had ended.
And I remember Bobby saying, "I'll never make it through the night with this smell," because he's smelling the bodies all day long and the stench and everything. And it was really the point of you were sick to your stomach to begin with. No one ate chow that night. We had our K-ration. No one ate. And I don't think there was a guy that slept that night. I don't think there was a guy that didn't cry openly that night.
Some German guards, filled with guilt for what they had done, also took their own lives. Many others were put on trial after the war and sentenced to prison, but only the camp commanders were sentenced to death. Among them was Rudolf Höss, the leader of Auschwitz, and Martin Weiss of Dachau. For the lower-ranking Germans, however, even though they were responsible for unimaginable cruelties, the maximum penalty they faced was a few years of imprisonment. Many of them were never even brought to court and managed to spend the rest of their lives in freedom, though not in peace. However, their anguish would never be comparable to that of the few survivors of the Holocaust, who witnessed firsthand one of the most barbaric acts in human history. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think the German guards killed during the liberation of the camps deserved their fate? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.